Hey guys, we're talking about part two of the Industrial Revolution. Look, we start off with this. The Industrial Revolution, 18th century, first industrialized nation in the world is Britain. Industrial Revolution, to review, Industrial Revolution is based essentially on cost-saving machinery, the ability to use machines to replace human labor to mass produce items, and in doing so, mass production means mass consumerism. So when you produce a lot of things, you got to sell a lot of things, and so we begin to see the growth of industries. First industry in the Industrial Revolution, of course, is the textile industry. Second major industry in the Industrial Revolution is the railroad, and of course the use of steam engines for transportation. You're producing all these items, and now you've got to be able to transport these items. You can sell these items. So we begin to see in the 18th, early 19th century this free-for-all involvement in industry, mass producing in England. And of course, as England begins to succeed, the Industrial Revolution begins to be exported to Europe and exported to other parts of the world. As it began to expand, it of course had problems. Now, once again, it's easy to rag on the Industrial Revolution. Certainly my generation did, an industry and technology. Your generation loves technology. But understand that unregulated industry meant that there were a lot of people who simply fell under the wheels of this industrial monster. A lot of poverty, a lot of excess. I talked last time about England having high pollution. We talked about, if we didn't, a rise in prostitution, a rise in alcoholism. All these things were the negative side of the growth of the Industrial Revolution. By the early 19th century, the Industrial Revolution had moved over to Europe. And as it began to expand through France and through the German states and through Spain and other countries, different countries took to it more quickly than others. But it began to spread inevitably. And as it did, so did the negative. So did the problems, the imbalance in wealth, the fact that a few people seem to be making a great deal of money while the vast majority of people seem to be making very little. As a result of this, you began to see people, a backlash. People began to say there's something wrong here. There needs to be a solution to these problems that the Industrial Revolution is creating. Many of these people will be lumped together in what's called the utopian movement, because almost all of their ideas ended up creating some kind of a utopia. If you follow my advice, we will create this perfect world. Almost all of them were socialist. Now, there's a lot of talk in this country, in the United States, about socialism. So let's make sure we understand what it means, because I see a lot of people talking negatively about socialism, and yet they seem to be very strong socialists. And what I mean by that is this. Socialism essentially means that you believe that everybody in the state should have a minimum standard of living, So everybody in the state will share and have at least have a minimum housing, a minimum medical care, a minimum income, a minimum education. Now, there'll be plenty of people who have better medical and better education and because you have to have rich. The whole idea in a socialist state is that you tax the rich, create social programs for the poor, so you can reach this minimum level for all citizens. Everyone will have at least this. That's the basic idea of a socialist state. Socialism becomes very, very popular. And I say people or socialist guys, we have things like Social Security. We pay farmers not to grow things. There's all these things come out of taxes. Right? The more taxes are collected to pay for things that we all use, the more of socialism we are. I often hear people complaining about socialism. At the same time, they're going to pick up their Social Security check and they're going to get their Medicare. This is all some form of socialism. Nonetheless, socialism begins to spread throughout Europe. And one of the most active and certainly troublesome socialists in Germany was a man named Karl Marx. Karl Marx in the 1820s became such a problem that he was kicked out of Germany and he ended up in England. And while in London, he began to do some research on human history. He came up with a theory that we call the theory of communism. He will write two major books, The Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, in which he will attempt to explain his theory. Essentially what Marx says And this is basic communist theory, guys, all right? If you're interested, there's plenty of in-depth books on this. But the basic theory of communism is this. Marx said, all of history has been a struggle between two groups, the bourgeois and the proletariat. The bourgeois have the power and they have the money, the wealth. The proletariat are the workers, not peasants. And peasants are slaves as far as Marx is concerned. He said we're talking about workers, people who go and work and produce and earn some kind of wage or money. Marx said all through life there's been this struggle between workers, in which include farmers, free farmers, and the bourgeois. The problem is, very clearly, that there are a lot more proletariat than bourgeois. And Marx said the bourgeois know this. So they've spent all of history, all of human history, basically trying to keep the proletariat fighting each other. If the proletariat fight each other, they're not paying attention to what the bourgeois are doing. So Marx said they've created things to keep the proletariat at each other's throats. For instance, Marx said nationalism. He said, Spanish, German, Chinese. He said there's no such thing as that. There's no such thing as nationalism. There's workers and there's bourgeois. These other things are nationalism is made up. Ethnicity, he said. This is a made up concept. This idea of race, even, he said. Another concept that keeps the proletariat at each other's throats. Marx said God, religion. He called it the opium of the people. This idea that no matter how bad your life is, someday you're going to, when you die, you'll go to heaven and you'll sit on the right hand of God. And of course, in the Bible itself, it says how difficult it is for a rich man to get into heaven, as difficult as it is for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. Right? So someday, even though this life is bad, someday for eternity, you will live in heaven. And the rich man will be judged the same as you are judged, and perhaps even a little harsher than you are being judged. So just hold on. Marx said this is simply a drug. This is a way of keeping people under control while the bourgeois exploit the system, exploit everybody for wealth and power. He said, every society in human history will go through three stages at different times, but nonetheless, they will inevitably go through them. The first stage will be capitalism. At some point, a society will reach capitalism. Capitalism, free market, defined by Adam Smith, this idea of demand and supply, selling your items open on the free market. He said, the problem with capitalism is that it's based primarily on greed and competition. And Marx said that this drive for wealth, for competition, will eventually drive capitalists into bankruptcy. You can't make it happen. They will do it themselves. They, through their greed, will drive themselves into bankruptcy. And when they do, in a society, not all over the world at the same time, but in each individual society, as the capitalists drive themselves into bankruptcy, as they begin to collapse, the people will rise up and they will create the second stage. And that second stage is socialism. We will create a socialist state. The people will rise up. They will tax the rich. They will create programs for the poor to make sure that everyone has a basic minimum standard of living. Eventually, this society will reach communism. Communism everybody will have the same share of the wealth of the state. No matter whether you're a medical doctor or whether you're a street cleaner, you will have the same housing, the same medical care, the same access to education. And when somebody puts in an extra 4 hours of work in a day, they're not doing that for extra pay. They're doing that for the benefit of the community. So Marx said eventually every society will reach communism. So there's capitalism, socialism, communism. But Marx said was that this is to use a communist Marxist term, an historical inevitability. It's going to happen. The catch is you can't make it happen. And you can't stop it. It's going to happen, but it has to happen in its own time. Now, later on, we'll be talking about Lenin and Russia, and hopefully getting a little bit to Mao. Mao and Lenin will create their own versions of Marxist communism. It's the reason why in Russia and China it's not called Marxist communism. Leninist communism, Maoist communism, they will take their own bits and pieces from Marx's idea and have their own. So have we ever had a Marxist state in the world? And the answer is no, we've never had a Marxist communist state. Perhaps because it's impossible. Maybe it will never happen. Maybe it shouldn't happen. I don't know. But it's never actually happened. Marx's ideas become very, very popular, not in his own lifetime, but over the next few decades. As it begins to grow in popularity and the abuses of the Industrial Revolution increase, Marxist communism will become very popular, particularly in Western Europe. Now, by the mid-19th century, the Industrial Revolution and its pluses and its minuses have made their way across the Atlantic Ocean, and they've come to the United States. The United States got involved in the Industrial Revolution slower. I mean, we were behind most others, primarily because we were focused on other issues. We had, first and foremost, Western expansion, what is called manifest destiny. This term manifest destiny only started to be used in the 1840s. And you began to see it in newspapers. But it's a concept that really describes all of early American history. It's this idea, and Manifest Destiny says, that we Europeans, we have a God-given right, a mission from God, to spread throughout North America, because where we go, we bring democracy, we bring capitalism, we bring Christianity, we bring liberty. That was the whole idea. In order to do that, we were going to have to commit a war of genocide against the Native Americans and kill off most of them, which is exactly what we did. In colonial times, we began to move westward. By the beginning of the 19th century, we are expanding into the Midwest, making it all the way to California. And as we do, and as we expand in our federal government, we create states. And every time a new state is created, that new state sends representatives to Washington, D.C. Here's the beginning of the other major distraction for Americans, and that's going to be the American Civil War and, of course, the question of slavery. We often think of the American Civil War as being a war fought over slavery and the freeing of the slaves. But in fact, that really wasn't the major issue. The major issue of the American Civil War was politics, political power. Every time a new state was created, they sent 2 senators to Washington, and they sent representatives based on population to Washington. Now, even in the early period of the United States, there was something very clear about our society. The northern states, primarily pro-industry, pro-banking, and as a result, anti-slavery. There had been some slavery in the northern colonies, even in the early northern states, but it had never taken off because the northern states were not really agricultural. In the South, you had an agricultural society based on slavery. Now, it's very clear, guys, that slavery was not an economical way of creating labor in the South. Even by the time of the American Civil War in 1861, less than 10% of Southerners owned slaves. But slavery began to be adapted or connected to a cultural idea. It wasn't just that you owned slaves. It was the idea that owning slaves or slavery was part of being Southern. Now, my point being, guys, that as they began to move west and they began to create new states, you began to see a power struggle in Washington, D.C. Who's going to control the federal government? Well, the House of Representatives is always going to be controlled by the northern pro-business, anti-slavery group, because that's where most of the population is. New York, Boston, all these major cities, as they're moving west, major communities, pro-business communities usually went for the north. More agricultural states usually allied with the southern, pro-slavery states. The problem with that is that while in the House of Representatives, the northern anti-slavery movement usually had control, in the Senate, you only send 2 senators per state. So it doesn't matter how large the population is, you have equal representation. The struggle, economic, social conflict between North and South as they begin to move west is fought out in Washington, D.C. The South knew that as long as they had at least some control or balance over the Senate, they could always counter the House of Representatives, which was going to be controlled by the much more populated northern pro-business, pro-industry states. But as you began to move west, that imbalance began to become a problem. For instance, in 1820, you have the Missouri Compromise. Missouri's coming in as a new state. Missouri Compromise is clearly a pro-slave state. The North is not going to allow the South to get control of the Senate with 2 new senators. So they created a new state. And they cut off a piece of Massachusetts and created the state of Maine. Maine will be a northern state, anti-slavery, pro-business. Missouri will come in with the pro-slavery, pro-South, keep some balance in the Senate. But you can't keep doing this forever. By 1850, you've got California coming in. California is going to be an anti-slavery state. Right? Well, now we have an imbalance here. So there's no new state that they're going to bring in. So instead, they have the Compromise of 1850. This says California can come in as a non-slave state, but the South says we want some concessions. We want a fugitive slave law that makes it illegal, and people will be punished. It had always been illegal, but people will be punished if they hide runaway slaves in the North. Other laws will try to bolster the slave institutions in the South. But by 1854, it was becoming very clear that this political struggle in Washington, who's in charge, Southern pro-slavery states, Northern anti-slavery states, pro-business, by 1854, this political division had become so clear-cut. In many ways, it reflects our own divisions today in the United States. So we have such a clear divisions of thinking. In 1854, you had the creation of the Republican Party. Now, the Republican Party was created specifically as a pro-Northern anti-slavery party. We'll come back to part 3 here.